I beat the daring Roman, I beat the daring Turk, defeated Nero's army with 30 minutes work. I fought the greatest leaders and licked them every one. That is about the biggest thing that man had ever done.
I've been an admirer of the Manchester Lit and Phil as a historical outfit for a very, very long time. I mean, 20 years, and to come to the society where people like Robert Owen and John Dalton cut their intellectual teeth is extraordinary for me, and I'm really, really thrilled by this invitation. So thank you very, very much. And we spent a wonderful afternoon in the People's History Museum and the Museum of Science and Industry looking at enormous locomotives, some of which are called things like Vulcan, Ariadne and Hector. So, now, every one of us here and in the wider world has a different experience of the Greek and Roman classics. Or to put it another way, there'll be a wide divergence in the amount we, in this room, do or do not know about ancient Greek and Roman culture and the ancient Greek and Latin languages and our interest in them and attraction to or revulsion from them. It was in the early 18th century that what were rather grandiosely then called the classics were adopted as the bedrock of elite school and university curricula. It really isn't hard to find historical evidence for the usefulness of a classical education to maintaining social hierarchies and reinforcing social exclusion, and I would be completely wrong if I didn't admit this fully. Philip Dormer Stanhope, 4th Earl of Chesterfield, wrote to his son in 1749, "Classical knowledge, that is, Greek and Latin, is absolutely necessary for everybody. The word illiterate in its common acceptance means a man who is ignorant of these two languages." In a series of breathtaking acts of rhetorical exclusion, classical knowledge is here limited to linguistic knowledge, education to men, and literacy to reading competence in ancient Greek and Latin. This letter was later published in a collection under the title Letters to His Son on the Art of Becoming a Man of the World and a Gentleman, and some of the letters are actually in Latin. And the association of the Greek and Latin classics with the maintenance of the British class system has left deep marks on our culture in this country, which unfortunately, or fortunately, are still powerfully affecting debates over the place of these classics in our schools and universities today. It is very difficult today to get access to tuition in the Latin language in the state school system. When it comes to Greek, in my view, the language of the foundational texts, not only of literature, but of science, maths, astronomy, medicine, history, geography and philosophy, there is now scarcely a state school in the land where you can even hope to learn the alphabet. A small number of state schools, some of them aided by charities such as Iris and Classics for All, teach classical civilization or ancient history to A level, or at least GCSE. But this is very rare, and I speak as one who has taught at British universities for nearly 30 years, and I've been involved in admissions at the universities of Reading, Oxford, Cambridge, Durham and London. I do know whereof I speak, at least as far as England is concerned. In general, most applicants seeking to study any degree course relating to our ancient Mediterranean cultural forebears were privileged from the day they were born. The writer Blake Morrison recently told me that his whole life had been affected by the fact that he couldn't do the Latin O-level at his Yorkshire Secondary Modern, which was required at the time for entrance to Oxbridge. He read English at Nottingham instead, and has become a brilliant writer, and he's developed a powerful interest in ancient literature, especially that in Greek. But he still feels, he reads it all in English, and he still feels slightly sore about the way his intellectual endeavours as a schoolboy were regarded as somehow second class. So I'd like to set you all a mini questionnaire. I may return to it at the end, and I promise there are no right answers, and you won't have to tell anybody anything. Are you inherently interested, and be honest, in the ancient Greeks and Romans? So John Dalton wasn't. He was bored stiff with them, and he wanted to go and do his physics. Do you think they deserve any substantial place in our consciousness today, firstly? Secondly, did you personally get any access offered to them at school, university, or elsewhere? And thirdly, was the amount of exposure you received related to your financial status or the social aspirations of your family? What was your experience? Mine was as the daughter of an impoverished vicar who got a grammar school place at Nottingham Girls High School and was lucky enough to get practically anything I wanted offered to me on the old grammar school ticket. Since my own conviction is that the study of ancient Greece and Rome, if taught imaginatively, can play a transformative role in contemporary society, I choose as our expert on tonight's journey Britain's most original radical thinker, Tom Payne, born a decade before the Earl of Stanhope wrote that snobby letter. Payne was one of Britain's most original radical thinkers and far from the knee-jerk opponent of the study of antiquity that he's usually depicted as. A key player in the American Revolutionary War, through the influence of his pamphlet Common Sense, 1776, and in French Revolution, which gave rise to his epoch-making Rights of Man, 1791, it was his irreverence towards classical antiquity which scandalised his contemporaries and has ever since been misunderstood by scholars who only read his most famous writings. Actually, there are 4 fat volumes of collected works which I've ploughed through. Payne did, however, have 4 well-thought-out objections to the classicism of ruling class writings, and I'm going to take each one of Payne's 4 objections as this lecture and give my answer to that. So, stance in relation to human progress. He said, to worry about the Greeks and Romans too much is backward-looking and therefore inherently conservative. It's always looking back, not forward. Content, he said, classical culture, whether it's tragedy or architecture, was produced by, for, the elite in what was a very hierarchical society, so we're already dealing with artwork produced for an elite. Practice, he says, it's just plain time-consuming to learn the ancient languages, and therefore time-wasting. If you're going to do Latin and Greek all day, every day, from the age of 8, then you don't get to learn the basics of engineering, which he liked. And the history of it has actually, he said, dominantly been used to fulfil reactionary purposes. So because it's fulfilled reactionary purposes in the past, it kind of inevitably will carry on doing so. So that's his 4 points, made in his writings in the late 8th century. So I'm going to take them one by one. I'm going to start with stance. Payne saw classics as inherently atavistic and backward-looking. He thought it prevented the living generations from looking forward into a better future and thinking how it might be achieved. He saw classical education as like looking at history from a seat of a carriage facing backwards, seeing everything that happens as vanishing towards the most distant horizons of the past, rather than sitting in the front-facing seat and looking to the horizons of the future. It's a very basic distinction about how you think about the place of your generation in the world. In modern terms, like to think he might have said it was like eternally looking in the rear view window at what's behind you, like the picture on the left, obscuring and blurring what can be seen through the windscreen ahead of you. This not only leads to accidents, but to a failure to think flexibly and innovatively. This is his case. I actually have to say that I wholeheartedly agree. And that if you stare into the rear view window all the time, you will crash. My idea of the appropriate place of the study of the past, not just the Greeks and Romans, but all periods of history, is as occupying a relatively small corner of our field of vision, like the picture on the right, but an absolutely crucial one. Knowing what's behind you, if used carefully, is essential to keeping the car of the present moving forward safely, progressively into the future. So I like to see classics as that. Yet Payne was correct that in his own day, compared with all other periods of history, the civilisations of ancient Greece and Rome were the ones most lauded, most adulated and emulated. He was adamant that this attitude prevented his contemporaries from seeing what they had himself achieved and thinking about how they could do better. He had no notion, he said, of yielding the palm of the United States to any Grecians or Romans that were ever born. Great progress had been made already, he thought, and in pouring praise on the wisdom, civil governments and sense of honour of the states of Greece and Rome, mankind had lived to very little purpose if at this period of the world they must go back 2,000 or 3,000 years for actual lessons and examples, we do great injustice to ourselves for placing them in such a superior line. And he also thought that excessive respect for the ancient aesthetic sensibility, whether it's beautiful white columns or classical statues, he thought that was completely daft. Payne said the most beautiful thing in the world was a woman. The second most beautiful thing was the Wearmouth iron bridge he'd designed. I love it. All right, that's dance. Let's think about content. The second argument, which Tom Payne and many others, usually on the left, have made against classical culture, relates to its content. The texts, buildings, and artworks of ancient Greece and Rome were paid for and created by and for the elite. This means that the texts, buildings, and artworks were originally created as vehicles for social concepts, ideas, ideologies, and tastes that upheld a phenomenally hierarchical society that few of us would want to live in. Slavery was universally practiced, women were universally oppressed, undemocratic constitutions were overwhelmingly the norm, from Sparta's brutal oligarchy of the warrior class to the revolting king worship of the Ptolemies of Alexandria, and the centralised dictatorship which was the Roman Empire. I know Boris Johnson and Mary Beard say it was great, but it was a centralised dictatorship. Do we really think that we have a great deal to learn from the literature, philosophy and art, however beautiful, of societies so unfair, so unequal, indeed so elitist? Moreover, the most important part of the ancient education remained for more than 1,000 years the epic poems of Homer, which told very self-consciously of the deeds of kings and queens in the heroic Bronze Age and celebrated their elevation over the ordinary masses. And I must admit that there have been times when I feel a certain amount of sympathy with this criticism of classics. For example, when I've taught courses on women in Antiquity, I ploughed through the 100th misogynist tract written by an ancient Greek or Roman male. When I've researched ancient slavery, and I can't find a single source which records the subjective voice and experience of an ancient slave. When I read the Olympic odes of Pindar, which celebrate victories in the Olympic Games, they celebrate the victories of the super rich at the ancient athletics games and insist that virtue and excellence are inborn and exclusive to a very small group of super rich families. I admit that I can understand the question of whether texts from an old, undemocratic, sexist, authoritarian and unfair society is necessarily edifying if we want to build a better world. I can understand why, after the Russian Revolution, such a battle was fought in Russia over the content of the new curriculum, when some of the debates about the role of the ancient classics in people's culture and on the curriculum that are engaging us today were being very thoroughly aired. I hear this. But if I had been in Russia defending classics 96 years ago, on the other hand, I'd have had lots to say. I would have stressed that new finds had begun to yield incredibly rich access to the lives of the less advantaged. From Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, we found a huge rubbish dump full of bits of old paper, ancient papyri, pieces of ancient paper, on which very provincial Greeks living in Egypt wrote. Some papyri have added to our collection of ancient literary texts, like Sappho and Sophocles, but far more give us very, very illuminating glimpses into the lives of the tradesmen and craftsmen of Upper Egypt Greeks, selling donkeys to each other, hiring musicians for wedding feasts, and fighting over the paternity of a baby. I would say the fables of Aesop are now being reassessed as the stories told to each other by the servile and lower classes, but this is actually a remains of ordinary people's culture. And scholars, including myself, have started to take a much greater interest in the relics of the forms of entertainment which we know reach even the most illiterate and slave class people in antiquity, such as the danced versions of myth in the theatre, which was enjoyed in Roman imperial territories. It was actually called pantomime because the star dancer, who was a male ballet dancer, impersonated all the roles. That's panta, he mimed, mimos, all the different characters, different masks. And this was doing the ancient myths through a non-verbal art form, which meant it could be understood in the amphitheatres where the language was neither Latin nor Greek, but Nubian, Dacian, Syriac, or Gallic. It was almost certainly performed in St Albans, for example, at Bury Lane. Okay? But to me, the best answer to this objection, that they're inherently, the content of classics is elitist, lies in the argumentative and contested nature of authority and social hierarchies, which is absolutely ingrained in the texts themselves when you start reading them. Arguments about how power is allocated in society occur in practically every ancient text you care to read in English. In our culture, we may have Robin Hood and William Tell, but the ancients had at least 12 fully paid-up heroes of the class war in their repertoire of stories. You've heard of Spartacus, I'm sure. You may have heard of the Gracchi, who wanted to redistribute the land and give poor people bread. Brutus, the founder of the Roman Republic. Prometheus, the rebel god who gave fire to man. Hercules, who endured an incredibly long period of slavery himself and rescued manual labourers like Atlas, who had to hold up the world like a pack slave. Simon, the philosophical cobbler, and many others. I'm writing a book about them. It's going to be direct access to all these, the Robin Hoods of ancient history and myth. Even the earliest and most king-obsessed text of them all, the Homeric Iliad, sets up the issue of inherited power versus status gained through merit in the very first quarrel between the King of Kings, Agamemnon, who said, "You must obey me because I have inherited my kingly power," and his best warrior, Achilles, aka Brad Pitt, who says, "Stuff you, I'm winning this war for you on my merit." It's an extraordinary way to start an epic poem. Direct, revolutionary conflict of inherited power and power based on your actual ability. But it's in the second great quarrel of the poem that the question of social class is directly raised. Thersites, an ordinary Greek soldier, suggests to the army that they spent quite enough years at Troy fighting for arrogant social superiors, and they just ought to take to the ships and go home. For just a few minutes, there's incredible tension before Odysseus takes hold of his kingly sceptre and bashes Thersites, turning him into a figure of ridicule instead of Agamemnon. But just the presence of that scene tells us a very great deal about the tensions always underlying ancient hierarchical society. And I have found that if you perform this in class or a lecture hall, it can still completely energise a classroom if it's acted out. And in tracing reactions to Thersites over the centuries, we discover, if you look up, guess what, right-wing critics of the Iliad, they say he's a seditious mutineer. If you look up left-wing critics, he's a spokesman of the people, a revolutionary democrat, and a first trade unionist. But you get to have that discussion. All right, Payne's third objection to classics was much more utilitarian, the waste of time argument. This is a machine, the Eureka machine, in 1845, which John Clarke built for composing hexameter Latin verses. He exhibited at the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly, and by extraordinary technological things which I don't fully understand, he pre-encoded Latin words on turning cylinders whose projecting pins would cause letters to drop, forming Latin verses. I don't know why we've got Stonks and Vision there, that's my fault. But this machine was created to help boys produce properly scanning verses in the Latin hexameter. Waste of time? This was meant to cut the time. They had actually mechanised. The Industrial Revolution is cutting the time it's spent to produce Latin hexameters. All right. He thought, Payne, it was a waste of time to learn the very elaborate grammars and vocabularies of dead languages when children and young people already had so much information to absorb with a direct, practical application in the modern world. Science, engineering, physical geography, geology, modern languages, mathematics, the law, and the conventions of commerce. True learning, he insisted, does not consist, as the schools now make it consist, in the knowledge of languages, but in the knowledge of things to which language gives names. Children who were forced to learn classical languages, he said, were left no time to understand the real world around them, especially science. Children at traditional schools, said Payne, had their genius killed by the barren study of a dead language. And although he had attended the grammar school in Thetford, Norfolk, he hadn't himself learned Latin because even though it was available to him, because his Quaker father objected. It's the language of the Roman Catholic Church. But Payne still managed, very bright now, to gain an impressive general education, reading in English, by the time he was apprenticed to that corset maker at the age of just 13. He also thought that one of the goals of the imposition of the study of dead languages by the leaders of the Christian establishment, whether Roman Catholic or Anglican, was not just to shore up its dogmatic versions of history and the material world, but to occupy the minds of the young, to impede the advancement of physical science. He actually thought it was designed to fill your head up so that you couldn't wonder about how the human race had evolved. It became necessary to their purpose to cut learning down to a size less dangerous, he said, and this they effected by restricting the idea of learning to the dead study of dead languages. I mean, that's the paranoid view. This is Tom being paranoid. But anyway, I do actually have it's the only one of his arguments that I have a great deal of sympathy with. The only one. We definitely don't want to revive the 18th century and Victorian classical syllabus, imposed on boys in a wide range of schools with the aid of the birch, and the terrors of translating into the ancient tongues as well as out of them. Of course, I was let off that as a girl. For some reason, I wasn't expected to compose in Latin and Greek. That was for boys. My brother at the boys' high school over the road in Nottingham did compose. I was a girl. I just read. I don't think that composing in Latin and Greek, although fun and, I'm afraid, surprisingly appealing to children. They do love a bit of Latin, the Harry Potter-esque Latin. I don't think it's any substitute for learning to express themselves articulately in their own languages and acquiring all the skills and information necessary to operate in our technologically advanced democracies. But Payne's arguments simply do not apply to the teaching of classical civilization, myth and history to the young. They do not apply. And I'm going to return to that at the end of the lecture. So his fourth argument against traditional classical education was that it had already in his day been dominantly used to fulfil the reactionary purposes of rich and powerful people with elitist agendas. He saw classics being used in dodgy ways. But I disagree with him here. It isn't difficult, I admit, to document the elite taste for the antique in most periods of cultural history. It is slightly more difficult to document the interest in antiquity of the lower classes and the underprivileged, but it really isn't impossible. And it's the excavation of the interest of the non-elite in Britain between 1789 and World War II is what I'm delighted, finally, after many struggles, to have received funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council to research. I'm afraid that means your taxes. That's the government. For every example of ancient Greece or Rome being adopted as the cultural property of the elite, it is possible to find a progressive or non-elitist counterexample. And with the sterling assistance of Dr. Henry Stead, my postdoctoral researcher on the project, we're building up just such a collection of evidence so we can counter that argument. We can show just how inspirational and creative and transformative classics has been, as well as elitist, on our website. And we hope that it's going to stand as a permanent resource for people advocating the importance of engaging with antiquity in modernity. And to illustrate what I mean, I'm going to break this last section down into 4 further subcategories: aesthetic uses of antiquity, educational uses of antiquity, religious uses of antiquity, and uses in terms of social and political argumentation and ideology. So first, aesthetics. If you follow the classical precepts of Aristotle, if you're going to write a decent, serious drama, a tragedy, you need to pick a hero from an aristocratic family, like Oedipus, King of Thebes. Aristotle said that in an ideal tragedy, a nobleman's happiness is overturned, and it seems to have been obvious to ancient audiences that it was more tragic to have your happiness overturned if you'd previously been rich and powerful than if you'd been of low estate. And this theory of tragedy, putting kings at the centre of the stage, was very agreeable to the Renaissance and early modern creators of neoclassical theatre. Most of the royal families of Europe, of course, actually trace their genealogies directly from the ancient Trojans. And they were the people with the money, power and leisure to finance the production of art and literature. But I can make two counter-arguments here straight away. First, the tragedy of Oedipus, as Sophocles wrote it, and as I teach it, actually has the people of Thebes, the chorus, at its centre, suffering terribly because of the corruption and crime in their ruling class. And they express surprisingly mutinous sentiments. If you actually read it carefully, that's what's going on. And this was noticed already by the early 18th century Enlightenment thinkers in France, and fundamentally informs, for example, Voltaire's version, Oedipe. Secondly, there's no reason at all why the endlessly fertile medium of tragic drama, dark, sad drama about important issues, can't have a non-elite hero as its centre, as many playwrights, including the great Arthur Miller, have shown. Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman in 1949 can be read as the direct descendant of Sophocles' Oedipus. He's the willful head of a family, his psyche is disintegrating, his sons are destined to inexorable strife between them and fratricidal conflict, and Willie's inevitable self-destruction provides the climax to the very taut action. But Loman's tragedy is that he's worked all his life for 50 weeks a year at a job he hates. A different form of unfreedom from that of Sophocles' aristocratic hero, since the forces of post-war capitalism for Miller have replaced Sophocles' ruthless gods. Miller's transformation of the classical paradigm of tragedy gains much of its power and authority from that critical classical undertext. Or take this image, which I'm very fond of, From the Depths, created by an artist called William Balfour Kerr in 1905. He's a Canadian of Scottish background, and he created it to illustrate a novel on class struggle called The Silent War by John Ames Mitchell, published in 1906 in New York. And to represent the decadent life of luxury enjoyed by the North American fin de siècle wealthy, he inserts, if you look carefully, replicas, can you see them, right at the top, of two of the most widely familiar of all ancient statues. Can you see on the top level there's the Discobulos with his viscus and the Venus de Milo. Right? They act as a kind of shorthand there for elitism, snobbery, wasted money and reactionary taste. The image became famous, very famous, especially in America, circulating widely as a print suitable for framing. The prosperous class are dancing at their society ball in expensive and elegant clothes. Their backward-looking cultural aspirations and tastes are powerfully symbolised by these two large copies of the famous antique statues, which represent ideal male and female beauty, respectively. But the fantasy world enjoyed by the ball-goers only thinly masks the real subterranean murky world of labour which makes their wealth possible. Seen here, erupting from literally beneath the dancers' feet and threatening to overturn the class system altogether. In this picture, the smashed ceiling floor actually represents a call to social change. Kerr uses an aesthetic technique where an abstract idea from economic theory that labour is providing the wealth that creates this party literally breaks apart the conventional realism of the upper class world in the top half of the engraving. But the clean lines and shapes created by the limbs, both present and missing, of the classical statues are echoed in the postures and bodies of the working class men and women, if you look at how their bodies are set up. This complicates incredibly the apparently simple equivalence between the taste of the elite and classical iconography. So who were the really idealised humans in that painting, after all? My final example in aesthetics is a florid neoclassical painting, which is the poet on the left, Anacreon, sacrificing to the three graces, and it's the three graces I'm interested in, by Antonio Zucchi, RA, on display at Nostell Priory near Wakefield, National Trust. Zucchi was hired by Sir Rowland Wynne, 5th Baronet of Nostell, legendary for his extravagance in pursuing his case to the classical antique. When Rowland succeeded his father in 1765, he began to turn Nostell into a sumptuously Palladian stately home. He hired Robert Adam as architect and interior designer, Zucchi for the lavish figurative painting on classical themes, and Chippendale to make the furniture. The facade of Nostell featured the elaborate columns which Adam had recently made famous from the ruins of the Emperor Diocletian. He published engravings that only the palace of a Roman emperor was good enough for the 5th baronet. The Wynne family had originally been textile merchants, but had acquired their baronetcy as a reward for good behaviour on the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. They then started to make huge amounts of money, not only from textiles, but corn and the mining of coal, which was a developed industry around Wakefield by the mid-18th century. That's just the background to that painting. That's the wealth that bought that painting. The money that paid for Zucchi's 3 Graces was derived from the labour of thousands of people in South Yorkshire. And I like to compare this picture by this other one entitled 3 Graces by Cliff Rowe. A working class boy from Wimbledon, he left school at 14 but managed to get into the Wimbledon Art School. And he devoted his life to painting really very powerful pictures of people working in industry, many of which are in the People's History Museum here. They're sadly not on display. We won't try and find them today. But in the 3 Graces, much of the power of the image derives from Rowe's recasting of the 3 women working at a factory conveyor belt in the unmistakable postures of the 3 Graces. The one in the centre with her back to the viewer, a design concept which goes all the way back to Antiquity. It's in a famous mural at Pompeii. It's on a mosaic in the Sharper Museum in Syria. It recurs in Western art from Botticelli's Primavera of 1486. Its most famous instance is Canova's neoclassical statue group of 1816. But the very idea that such a vision of classical perfection could be located in an industrial setting with lower-income women in the roles of Grecian goddesses, calmly, that's rather magnificent, calmly in control of the complicated machinery they're operating, I think illustrates the profundity of Rowe's aesthetic. And in terms of education, our second category, the trope of the elitist function of classics pervades the Victorian novel. You only have to turn a page of the Victorian novel to find it. And by far the most famous example is in chapter 17 of David Copperfield, as illustrated here by Fred Barnard. In the complex class politics of the novel, the envious Uriah sees the young David as a privileged little snob. He is studying law in order to try to improve his income and social status. Without knowledge of Latin, the mark of an educated gentleman and much used in legal language, it's difficult for him to achieve some stream of self-improvement. David offers to teach him Latin. I'll teach you Latin, Uriah. He refuses. I'm not going to do the accent. Oh, thank you, Master Copperfield, he answered, shaking his head. I'm sure it's very kind of you to make the offer, but I'm much too humble to accept it. What nonsense, Uriah! Oh, you must excuse me, Master Copperfield. I am greatly obliged. I should like it of all things, I assure you, but I am far too humble. There are people enough to tread on me in my lowly state, without my doing outrage to their feelings by possessing learning. Learning ain't for me. A person like myself had better not aspire. If he's to get on in life, he must get on humbly, Master Copperfield. Latin is used for this inflammatory moment of refusal of climbing the class system. And yet, as Henry's now going to show for 5 minutes, because we want to show you our wonderful website, there are plenty of counter-examples for these real individuals whose education, however hard won, empowered them and helped them to challenge elitism.
Hello, I'm just going to show you the website, our website that you can access at classicsinclass.info. Please do visit and get in touch, because we want to learn from you other kind of encounters with classical culture. But I'm going to share with you just now 3 examples of some very, very great self-learners. Thomas Cooper, Gilbert Collins and Joseph Wright. So the first is this man, Thomas Cooper, who in 1805 was born to a fisherman's daughter and an itinerant dyer. He became one of the most remarkable of all the Chartist autodidacts. He taught himself Greek and Latin and became a tutor at the Lincoln Mechanics Institute. By 1843, he had become a convinced Chartist and worked as a journalist on a radical newspaper in Leicester. In his epic poem, The Purgatory of Suicides, written while he was in prison for sedition in Stafford Jail, he adopted the voice of Calanus, the Indian sage who Alexander the Great visited in India, to prophesy the global liberation and universal suffrage. Calanus is found in several ancient sources for Alexander the Great, and Cooper put his self-taught classical knowledge to important use by recasting the 4th century BC wise man's spiritual views in contemporary political terms. Now, Thomas Cooper's closest friend in Lincoln was a man called Gilbert Collins, who was a fellow Chartist and bank clerk. And he learnt his Latin at school, but he had to teach himself Greek at a later stage, and in fact ended up translating the whole of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey on his own, for his own use. His and Cooper's thirst for out-of-the-way languages and cultural challenges led them to begin studying together a book which Collins had found in an old bookshop. It was an Arabic grammar, and this is the frontispiece. As Cooper tells us in his autobiography, one evening George Boole, who was a famous mathematician, suddenly stepped in and found us earnestly bent over our new toy. He examined the quarto book with interest, but seemed to have difficulty in restraining his laughter when he saw our Arabic writing and heard us gravely say we were determined to learn the language. "But where will you get your Arabic books?" asked George, "and how can you read them without a dictionary? You could not get a copy of Richardson's dictionary, I should think, under some £12 or £15. We felt ashamed of our thoughtlessness and laid the project aside. It is both an inspirational tale and a somewhat sad one of two friends excited by and quite capable of learning a new language, only to be thwarted by limited funds. Joseph Wright, who worked from the age of 6 as a donkey driver at the stone quarry near his home in Bradford, and there he is, sitting with his pipe. At the age of 15, in 1870, he became a wool sorter and taught himself to read. He then joined a Wesleyan night school where he studied French, German and Latin, discovered his huge gift for languages and immersed himself in the fortnightly self-education magazine Cassell's Popular Educator. By 1925, he had not only won a PhD in classics from Heidelberg, but had even become a professor of comparative philology at Oxford. According to his wife, who wrote his biography, Wright insisted that it was owing to his plebeian ancestry that he brought with him to the field of science and letters that prodigious vitality of brain which enabled him to accomplish the intellectual feats which marked his progress. Joseph Wright is therefore not just an example of how a classical education could be used as a way of making enormous leaps up the socio-economic totem pole, but also he stands as an important reminder of how an informal or postponed course of education can lead a learner of any age or upbringing to the very forefront of his or her professional field. Who knows what would have happened if the humble Uriah Heep had taken those lessons from Master Copperfield after all.
I'm not going to talk much about religion because it's not quite the same issue now as it was for Tom Payne. But even teaching, he was living in a world where even science was taught in Latin. But fortunately, such a very good book, and it is translated into English as Latin, The Empire of the Sign, has been written by Françoise Waquet, that I'm certainly going to refer you to her. It's an extraordinary book. So our last case of the contestation of classics as cultural property concerns the dissemination of social and political ideas. The centrality of the ancient Greeks and Romans to the European curriculum very precisely coincides with the era of European imperialism. The Portuguese sailed to India convinced that they'd inherited the baton of European domination of the planet directly from the ancient Romans. And this is the epic poem that was written to celebrate the conquering of India by the Portuguese, the Lysiads of Camões. And it is a direct lift, most of it from the epics of Homer and Virgil. Arms and the heroes who from Lisbon's shores through seas where sail was never spread before, beyond where Ceylon lifts her spicy breast. It was in Portuguese, it's translated. Waves the woods above the watery waste, with prowess more than human, forced their way to the fair kingdoms of the rising day. What wars they waged, what seas, what dangers passed, what glorious empire crowned their toils at last. What kings, what heroes of my native land thundered on Asia and on Afric's strand. Let fame with wonder name the Greek no more. What lands he saw, what toils at sea he bore, Odysseus. No more the Trojan, Aeneas' wandering voyages boast. What storms he braved on many perilous coasts. No more let Rome exult in Trajan's name, nor eastern conquest Ammon's pride proclaim. A nobler hero's deeds demand my lays than ever adored the song of ancient days, illustrious Gama, whom the waves obeyed, etc. And this is the sort of now rather embarrassing kind of classics. And slavery was consistently both justified and celebrated with classical imagery. We cannot get away with this. An important defence of slavery was a book by Brian Edwards, published in 1793 at the height of the abolitionist debates. And Edwards sidestepped the issue of sexual relationships between white men and black slave women by reproducing a poem which tackles the theme with what now seems breathtaking frivolity. And it was a poem about this sable queen who arrives very, very happily, and this is the illustration to it, from Africa in the West Indies. It's a very, very powerful and rather devastating image by Thomas Stothard, The Birth of Venus, an almost naked and very dark, curvaceous woman, almost a parody of Botticelli's Birth of Venus, with a blank, unreadable face, drifts at sea, surrounded by uniformly white flying cherubs and muscular white male gods. The impact of the poem and the engraving together creates an obscene travesty of what Africans really experienced on the Middle Passage, and illustrates and legitimises white male fantasies about black women in their possession. It effaces all the violence and coercion from the relationship. The Venus looks on the tar with mild consenting eyes in the poem. In an extraordinary allegorical move, Venus and Neptune come to stand for the entire institution of slavery, conceived as an ideal love affair which somehow unites the physical perfection of the African body with the desiring subject of the narrative, the male slave merchants, an inheritance of the European cultural tradition. But here the counter-examples become incredibly interesting, and I have published a big book in 2011, jointly, a team effort called Ancient Slavery and Abolition. The abolitionists found the world of classical culture every bit as inspirational and useful as the plantation owners did. An almost exact opposite use of classical imagery is made on the cover of this American anti-slavery almanac in 1844. This offers an unmistakable allusion to the body through the simple position of the vulnerable black slave mother, prone on the ground but shielding her baby from the onslaught of the aggressive eagle. It's Prometheus being used very subtly, right, to argue against slavery. Near the patriotic symbol of the Capitol building, the stars and stripes floating overhead, the American eagle is co-opted as vicious raptor in a clear reference to the Prometheus myth. And Prometheus has indeed become one of the most important ancient figures for working people across cultural history. Meet Gilbert Dakin, miner and painter, whose symbolic, the miner enslaved, is perhaps the most poignant example in the long iconographic tradition which equates miners, slaves and other manual labourers with the fettered Prometheus. I've always admired this painting. The mythical undertext makes the picture stand out amongst Dakin's works, most of which portray miners in a realistic, dispassionate idiom. As an artist, he said, I lived in eternal dread of injury to my eyes or hands in the pit, but that has been my lot in life, and just as he feared, I just found this out last week. Disaster struck. He lost not his sight, but his life, when he was among 6 men killed in Warsop Main Colliery just before Christmas in 1939, the year after he painted that picture. He knew it would happen, he said, there's a siren at the pits and it rules my life. And in gender studies too, this isn't so much elitism, but it's interesting. Briefly, classical figures have been used both to justify and challenge the exclusion of women from full citizenship. Most notably, this example, the figure of Medea, who kills her own children because her husband being such a pig. In the 18th century, on the left, various crazed Medeas proved to their London audiences that women were irrational, oversexed, vindictive, and fundamentally incapable of reasoned argument. Yet, by 1907, an amazing actress called Edith Olive, a leading suffragette, took the stage as Medea at the Savoy Theatre in London, just after a whole lot of suffragettes had ended up in prison or were being force-fed, and recited Medea's astonishing monologue on the oppression of women. Medea, in 431 BC, complains about loneliness, economic humiliation, rape in marriage, all the things that women have put up with. So this was a suffragette version of the very same play. So, my conclusion. It will have become apparent by now that I do not think that studying ancient Greece and Rome is inevitably elitist. Of Tom Payne's 4 arguments, I actually think the most important is that learning the languages as if they're living tongues in which poetry as well as prose must be fluently composed can simply be a waste of time. But Tom Payne never said that learning about the history of the world, including the ancient world, was anything but constructive. He thought that ancient Greeks and Romans provided very useful comparisons from which to learn, provided they weren't held up as examples to emulate or invested with any kind of special status. They were another set of humans, albeit very articulate and interesting ones, in another set of socio-economic circumstances. And in fact, Payne knows a very great deal about ancient history and philosophy, which he's digested, and it's helped him think so originally. He even uses pseudonyms such as Aesop, Atlanticus, Comus, and Vox Populi. He shared the rest of the Enlightenment's interest in Plutarch's heroes, praising the actions of many, including the Gracchi, Pericles, Camillus, Epaminondas. He commended the wise words of the Athenians Solon, which have been paraphrased by Nelson Mandela about how society, you can judge a society by the condition of the poorest person. That's how you judge it, not the richest. Solon first said that the least injury done to the meanest individual was considered an insult to the whole Athenian constitution. And in Payne's passionate rhetoric against colonialism and tyranny, his love of ancient literature sometimes provides him with powerful images. What else, he thunders, was the status of colonial America to its British masters than that of Hector cruelly tied to the chariot wheels of Achilles? But more important than his general education in the writings of our cultural ancestors, imbibed in English translation, is his recommendation that comparison with Antiquity is an incredibly rewarding endeavour. Tom Payne, I think, would have wanted all of us to use classics like a rear-view window as an incredibly useful aid to understanding ourselves and our own position in time and human history, which we must keep in one form or another on the curricula of our children. For Payne recommended, for example, that revolutionary new republics would do well to institute societies for inquiring into the ancient state of the world and the state of ancient history. He suggested this. Let us not throw the rear view window out, but use it systematically to offer us the all-round vision which we will all need to survive. Thank you very much.